Surprise, sailor.
Welcome, friends. We are back talking Futurama, Season 12, Episode 2. This is the one entitled Quids Game. Now, spoilers do lie ahead, so if those aren't for you, consider this your final warning. Let's crack into the episode. Quids Game. Right off the bat, an obvious anagram of Squid Game, and that, for the most part, is what this episode is doing a reference or an homage to, poking fun at. However, unlike the first episode in this season, the one last week, the NFT fiasco we all had to endure, this did a Futuramaization of that concept and really just used it as a jumping off point. In fact, for the most part, aside from the fact that this is games to the death, or at least seemingly so, there really isn't a full-on connection to Squid Game. That was a jumping off point. The real bread and butter of this episode was taking a couple of tried and true Futurama tropes that have really cropped up in the past few seasons of this show, taking the childhood trauma, the childhood emotional baggage of Fry, and combining that with the extended Futurama cast coming together for some sort of wacky adventure, most likely splitting the cast up into two different teams and pitting them against each other. This all done under the umbrella of some super advanced, goofy sci-fi trope aliens making our teams fight each other because of information they gleaned from somebody's mind. And because this episode was taking place on Fry's birthday, and he was the first one to step foot or drip saliva on this planet, this episode was a recreation and a reenactment of his 8th birthday with a twist.
I like a good twist. That's what keeps the audience watching.
Okay, so I guess I should get into the meat and potatoes of what I actually thought of this episode. It was a definite marked improvement from the first episode, insofar as it did a lot of the things I appreciate Futurama for doing. Its own little jokes, its own little twists, its own little pop culture references that are a little askew. All of those things were nice. It didn't treat the source material of Squid Game as a one-to-one recreation of exactly what it is, and it did the emotional arc of Fry's childhood, gave us a little punch at the end. But for whatever reason, this episode still felt like it was missing a little bit of the soul of more of the classic Futurama stuff. It had all of the components, it put most of them together in a pretty good way, even utilizing a lot of the side cast we haven't seen in a while, but for some reason, there was a missing piece in this episode. I can't really put my finger on it. My real go-to explanation for when things like this happens is it just felt a little bit hollow. Definitely not a bad episode. I'm just wondering what that missing piece might be, and are we now at a point of Futurama where that piece of the soul is never going to come back, and we're never going to hit those heights of the classic era of the show? Well, it was great to see a lot of the classic recurring Futurama characters appear in this episode and have a little bit to do. Most of them were relegated to the background. I think it might have worked a little better just because it's been so long since we've seen some of them and had storylines based around many of them within Futurama and in the real world, that it could have felt a little bit better had they appeared in episodes prior to this, so we had a bit more of a reintroduction to them. Now, this is mostly a real world situation. If you're sitting down to binge Futurama down the line, it's not going to necessarily feel that way because there wouldn't be a substantial break of years since the last time you've seen them, so I'm probably just bringing my own baggage into that. And while for the most part the history of Futurama has always hit it out of the park when they rely on Fry's backstory with his family to give us a really emotional payoff, or one beat of the storyline at least that really lets us get hit in the heartstrings, I'm not going to go so far as to say this episode didn't do that. That little stinger at the end, specifically with Fry's mom about how they didn't let him lose during his birthday, it did have those emotional moments, but it felt like a pale comparison to a lot of the ones we've seen in the past. And I know that's probably partially because letting your kid win at an 8th birthday party doesn't pack the punch of talking to your mother through time, or your dead dog, or any of those things, or Fry learning that his brother went on to honor him after Fry was presumed dead. All of those things are much more of an emotionally heightened experience. This was more of a growing up in a learning situation, and I did appreciate it for what it was. It just didn't strike me nearly as hard as a lot of those other flashback moments that we've had in Futurama. When all is said and done, I enjoyed this episode. I can't necessarily say the same for last episode. This one I did enjoy, but when you really view it through the lens of Futurama as a whole, which whether or not it's fair, you kinda have to do when it's part of the same series, I think this is probably just a middle-of-the-road episode compared to a lot of the heavy hitters out there. However, it does still stand on its own compared to a lot of the really low-end, low-tier stuff. To me, it really just comes down to that missing piece that leaves this a bit hollow compared to a lot of the great Futurama episodes, and I'm hopeful they'll be able to find that piece and put it back into place later on this season. Those are my brief thoughts on this episode. What did you guys think of this episode? Do you think it's Futurama back hitting its full stride in full form, or are you kind of on the same page as me, feeling like it did a lot of great things, but there's still something missing? Or did you not care for it at all, or not even watching it? Whatever you think, leave all those thoughts down below. Like, share, subscribe, do all those YouTube things, which also includes giving me money. Until next time.
Penultimate means next to last. You lose the vocabulary game!